The wind whipped across the rocky escarpments of the Golan Heights, carrying with it the dust of centuries and the scent of something ancient fear. Lieutenant Colonel Yair Nafshi stood silently on a ridge, eyes narrowed against the sun, surveying the emptiness before him. There was no sign of movement, no thunder of engines, no flash of cannon. Just silence, a silence that was not peaceful, but tight and waiting, like the breath held before a scream. It was October 6th, 1973, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Across Israel, streets were deserted. Radios were off. Phones barely rang. Synagogues were full. And at the border, Israeli military outposts were thinly manned. Soldiers were fasting, praying, resting. Even the veterans believed that war, if it were ever to return, would not come today. But on the other side of the border, thousands of Syrian troops were finishing final checks. Commanders barked orders. T-55 tanks rumbled into position. Camouflage nets peeled back. Artillery crews stood ready. For months, they had rehearsed this moment, watched Israeli complacency grow like a weakness, and waited for this precise window when faith would turn into vulnerability. And then it happened. Without warning, the stillness shattered. The Syrian sky filled with the roar of fighter jets. Artillery rained down like a steel hurricane. Israeli soldiers, still lightheaded from fasting, ran to their tanks barefoot, some still in undershirts, others clutching rifles with no magazines. Radios screamed incomplete orders. The war had arrived uninvited, unexpected, and unapologetic. From the ridgeline, what unfolded was beyond comprehension. A horizon once barren now writhed with movement. Tanks, hundreds of them, a mechanical tide rolling forward, tracks grinding rock into dust, their turrets swinging like predators searching for prey. Israeli crews squinted into the haze and saw what they would later describe as a gray wall of armor, a steel Stampede 1,200 tanks strong. And yet they stayed. There were only 170 Israeli tanks on the Golan that day. Many were outdated. Most had no night-fighting capability. They were manned by reservists, teachers, engineers, even college students. Not professional warriors, not elite troops, but they climbed into those tanks anyway, because the alternative was unthinkable. Behind them lay the Sea of Galilee, then Haifa, then Tel Aviv. Behind them lay home. This is not merely a war story. It is a human story. It is about the raw instinct to hold the line, not because you think you will win, but because you know you must not lose. What happened next on that jagged stretch of land would become one of the greatest defensive tank battles in history. But for those who were there, it was not about glory. It was about survival. It was about grit. It was about standing on a ridge and refusing to retreat. Under the harsh light of a Middle Eastern sun, the Golan Heights stretches out like a forgotten battleground, carved by ancient hands. It is silent now, but not empty. The rocks remember. The ridges carry echoes. And for those who know its history, this barren volcanic plateau is not just a place, it is a statement, a symbol. A high-stakes vantage point soaked in blood and pride. When Israel captured the Golan Heights in 1967 during the Six-Day War, it was not just a territorial gain, it was a seismic shift in the balance of regional power. From these cliffs, Israeli soldiers could look down upon Syria's heartland. Damascus lay just 60 kilometers away. For the first time, Israel held the high ground, And Syria never forgot. Before that war, Syrian forces had used the Golan as a platform for near-constant shelling of Israeli towns and villages in the valleys below. Families lived under threat. Farmers plowed their fields with rifles slung over their shoulders. The Golan was not only a battlefield, it was a weapon. Its height gave Syria vision, range, and the psychological comfort of dominance. But in 1967, that comfort was ripped away. For the next 6 years, Syria burned with resentment. The loss at the Golan was not merely a tactical defeat, it was a national humiliation. And no humiliation cuts deeper than one rooted in identity and history. The land was more than land, it was honor, pride, a mark on the national soul that no speech, no negotiation, no ceasefire could erase. That is why, when the war broke out again in October 1973, the Golan became the first and fiercest battlefield. This time, Syria came not with sporadic artillery, but with an army designed to overwhelm. Tanks rolled forward in waves. Artillery opened like thunder. And from the valley below, a dust cloud signaled the approach of over 1,000 armored vehicles, an armored tidal wave crashing against the ridgeline. The strategic value of the Golan Heights is unquestionable. Its elevation turns defenders into watchers. From its peaks you can see for miles in all directions, track enemy movements, guide artillery, and predict the path of war. But elevation alone does not guarantee survival. What matters is who stands there and how long they are willing to hold. In 1973, Israeli soldiers stood there outnumbered, underprepared, and, in many cases, caught in the middle of a religious fast. Yet they did not abandon the heights, because the Golan was no longer just a military outpost. It was the final wall before the heartland. The last elevation before the soft underbelly of northern Israel. If the Syrians broke through here, they would have a clear path to the Galilee and beyond. That knowledge did something to the Israeli defenders. It changed the fight from a war for ground to a war for existence. And wars like that are not fought with just tanks and shells. They're fought with memory, with grit, with an understanding that if they lose this ridge, there may not be another line to draw. The terrain helped them, but it did not save them. People did. Tank crews, infantrymen, field commanders who refused to yield an inch. Reservists who raced from civilian life straight into hell. The Golan became a crucible where strategy, history, and human will collided. A place where men fought, not because they believed they would win, but because they could not afford to lose. This was no ordinary high ground. It was sacred to both sides. To Syria, it represented what had been taken. To Israel, it represented what had to be held at all costs. So when the dust rose and the tanks came and the sky filled with fire, the Golan Heights did not fall. It stood, scorched, cratered, haunted, but held. Because sometimes history chooses its battlegrounds not for their beauty but for their meaning. And the Golan Heights meant everything. October 6th, 1973. The streets of Israel are quiet, unnaturally so. Radios are off. Shops are closed. Tanks sit idle in their bases, half-manned and half-forgotten. Across the country, soldiers are home fasting, praying, reflecting. It is Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, a day meant for silence, forgiveness, and rest. A day when even war seems too loud to exist, but war does not ask for permission. On the far northern border, in the windswept heights overlooking Syria, Lieutenant Colonel Yair Nafshi is out on what was supposed to be a routine patrol. His orders are not unusual. Check the outposts, reassure the men, return to base. For weeks, Israeli intelligence had warned of Syrian troop movements, but they had cried wolf before. Nothing had ever come of it. The assumption, wrong but deeply ingrained, was that the Arabs would not dare strike again, not after 67. Not against Israel's seasoned forces, not on Yom Kippur. Then the phone call comes. A crackling voice from the Hermine outpost pierces the illusion. Yair, the Syrians are removing their camouflage nets. In that moment, the world shifts. No one has fired a shot yet. No tanks are rolling. But Nafshi does not need a formal report. He is seen enough, felt enough. The soldier's instinct kicks in, not shaped by orders, but by the weight of silence breaking apart. He turns his jeep around, races back to his men, and issues the order that will define the rest of their lives. Mount your tanks. They are not ready. Some are still fasting. Others do not even have their boots on. But there is no time. The border is minutes away. The Syrians are coming. And then it begins. The first shell lands like thunder. Then another, and another. Artillery rains down across the Golan in calculated, merciless waves. Syrian jets streak overhead, their engines screaming vengeance. The peaceful ridge lines become a furnace. Nafshi's men scramble for cover, scramble to respond, scrambling, above all, to understand. How did we not see this coming? The truth is painful. Syria had planned the attack for months, carefully, patiently, deliberately. And they had done it in plain sight. They moved troops to the border again and again, only to pull them back each time. It was psychological warfare. And it worked. Israeli intelligence eventually believed it was all a bluff. A game. A display of Arab frustration, not intent. So when the real attack came, it hit. Like betrayal. Like waking up to find the ground beneath you is already breaking apart. At the front lines, Nafshi's 74th Tank Battalion is among the few standing units ready to engage. But ready is a generous term. They are vastly outnumbered. Just a few hundred soldiers, most of them reservists, now face the weight of the Syrian 7th Infantry Division. Over 1,200 tanks, 50,000 men, hundreds of artillery guns. And they are coming fast. From the ridges, Israeli scouts describe the view with a mixture of awe and horror. It begins as dust on the horizon, tiny trails, almost harmless. Then the outlines of tanks begin to take shape, lines of them, dozens, then hundreds, like waves rolling forward. The Syrians are not holding back. This is not a test. This is war, fully unleashed. And yet, Nafshi and his men do not retreat. Their tanks, mostly Shotcal models, upgrades of the British Centurion, are powerful, but old. They are dwarfed by the sheer volume of Soviet-built T-55s pushing across the plains. Worse still, the Syrians have night vision equipment. The Israelis do not. But what the Israelis have, what Nafshi embodies, is something else, conviction. They know this land. They know these ridges. And more importantly, they know that there is no one behind them. If they fall, the road to northern Israel lies open. So they dig in, not just physically, but emotionally. This is the same Golan that saved Israel in 1967. Now it is asking to be saved in return. Nafshi's voice cuts through the chaos, anchoring his men. He issues calm orders. targets, ranges, movement. He knows he cannot stop the Syrians. But maybe, just maybe, he can slow them down. Long enough for reinforcements. Long enough for Israel to wake up. The battle that begins on Yom Kippur is not just about tanks or timing. It is about how nations survive when their enemies are already at the gates. It is about the value of instinct, the price of underestimation, and the thin, trembling line between disaster and resistance. And in that first hour of war, when the sky turns red and the ground shakes beneath incoming fire, one thing becomes clear: the Golan Heights will not be taken easily. Not today. Not while men like Yair Nafshi are still standing. Within hours, the sky above the Golan Heights turns black, not from clouds, but from the shadow of incoming jets. Syrian MiGs roar overhead in tight formations, their shrill engines screaming over the ridges like a death knell. On the ground, waves of artillery begin to pound the Israeli front. Not sporadically, not cautiously. This is saturation fire, carefully timed, ruthlessly executed. Every inch of terrain is scoured by explosions. The aim is not just to soften resistance, it is to bury it. And then comes the flood. Infantry surges forward, disciplined and determined. Behind them, the steel fist of the assault rolls into view. Tanks. Dozens. Then hundreds. Soviet-built T-55s with their short, brutal barrels and sloped armor. They have rehearsed this advance 100 times in the deserts outside Damascus. But now it is real. They push hard. 2 concentrated thrusts designed to crack the Israeli defense and pour armor across the heights like water through a dam. And at first, it seems to be working. The Israeli line bends, reeling under the weight of this armored avalanche. Some units are already falling back, tanks disabled or abandoned. Communications flicker. Reinforcements have not arrived. The defenders are thin, scattered, straining to hold what feels increasingly impossible. Every second stretches like a lifetime. But something goes wrong. Not with the Israeli defense, but with the Syrian advance. In their overwhelming confidence, the Syrians made a critical miscalculation. They brought their bridging equipment, the tools needed to cross the deep Israeli anti-tank ditches too far behind the lead elements. Their armored spearheads, eager and fast-moving, reach the defensive trench lines before the bridges do. And there, on the open approach to the heights, they stall. What was meant to be a swift armored punch suddenly turns into a traffic jam of steel and confusion. The T-55s, lacking orders, momentum, and support, begin bunching up near the Israeli lines. And the defenders, sitting atop the heights, can't believe what they are seeing. It is a gift. From the ridgeline, Israeli tank crews switch from panic to precision. Their Shotkel tanks, upgraded British Centurions, are heavier, better armored, and crucially, mounted with long-range 105mm cannons. The Syrian T-55s may be smaller and harder to hit at a distance, but up close, trapped at the base of a hill, they become easy prey. And that is exactly what they are. From well-fortified positions, Israeli gunners begin to pick them off, one by one. Tank commanders calmly issue fire commands, adjusting for range, waiting for the next silhouette to crawl into sight. Dust and smoke mix into a brutal haze. The battlefield turns into a metal graveyard. Some Syrian tank crews try to maneuver out of the kill zone, but the trench is unforgiving. Others panic, turning blindly into one another. Radio chatter becomes frantic. Command breaks down. What was supposed to be a decisive breach becomes a massacre. And yet, the Syrians do not stop. That is the astonishing thing. Even under withering fire, they continue to push, wave after wave, regiment after regiment. The soldiers driving these tanks are not cowards. They are not untrained. They are committed, brave, and willing to die to reach the top of those ridges. But will is not always enough, because as they struggle to move forward, the Israelis, though vastly outnumbered, begin to understand something critical. The heights are still theirs. The line is not broken. And with each Syrian tank that burns, with each moment the bridging equipment stays stuck behind the lines, the chance of Israeli survival grows. The terrain, the training, and the pure refusal to yield begin to pay off. This is not to say it was easy. Far from it. Israeli crews fought with dwindling ammunition. Communications were spotty. Many tanks were lost. Casualties mounted. At times it seemed the line would buckle. But it did not. And that is the point, because war is not decided by numbers alone. It is decided by how long you can hold out when the world is crashing down around you. And on the slopes of the Golan, something ancient awakened in those Israeli defenders, not just fear, not just duty, but something deeper. The knowledge that there was no room to retreat, no fallback, no second line, just the ridge, the tanks, and the will to survive. So while the Syrian assault was vast, coordinated, and ferocious, it had flaws. And in war, a single flaw can be fatal. By nightfall, the battlefield was littered with the wrecks of ambition. And though the war was far from over, the defenders of the Golan had done what many believed impossible. They had held. From the ridgeline, Israeli tankers watched the valley below transform into a battlefield, choked with movement and dust. Syrian tanks T-55s in endless formation advanced across the rocky terrain, like a mechanized swarm, pushing hard and fast toward the Israeli line. But the defenders held the high ground, and in war, elevation can be the difference between survival and slaughter. Up on those jagged slopes, Israeli crews manned their showdown tanks. These were not new machines. They were upgraded British Centurions, decades-old designs made modern through necessity. But age did not matter here. What mattered was purpose. And what mattered even more was perspective. From this height, the showdowns could see and strike long before the enemy below even knew where to aim. The Syrians, despite their numbers, had a problem. Their tanks were built for Soviet doctrine: fast, numerous, simple. The T-55s were nimble and compact, but their effectiveness relied on coordination and mass. And coordination was already beginning to fray. The bridging equipment was still delayed. Forward momentum was turning into chaos. Tanks clustered near the anti-tank ditches, unsure of their next move. And from above, the Israelis took full advantage. Israeli gunners operated with chilling calm. They knew their 105mm cannons outranged the 100mm guns on the Syrian tanks. They knew the valley's choke points. They had trained for this exact scenario not just in drills but in memory. Many of them were veterans of the 1967 war. They understood what this terrain demanded, and they had no illusions about the stakes. Inside the showdowns, the tension was suffocating. The smell of diesel, the heat from the engine blocks, the tight metal interiors. These were tanks designed for utility, not comfort. But they did their job. The crews worked like extensions of the machine: loader, gunner, commander, driver, each with a role, each with a rhythm. Spot the target, range it, fire, adjust, fire again. And below, the Syrian tanks burned. It was not one-sided. Syrian gunners fought back with ferocity. They targeted Israeli positions with everything they had, and many Israeli tanks were hit, some destroyed outright. But the ground favored the defenders. The Shotkals dug into reverse slopes, exposed only their turrets, then repositioned before the enemy could return fire. They fired from cover, then disappeared behind rocks and ridgelines like ghosts. In one sector, a single Israeli platoon held a hilltop against an entire Syrian armored company. The tank commander, barely older than his crew, gave calm, clipped orders under fire. One shot, then move. One hit, then shift. It was the tanker's version of guerrilla warfare, not with rifles, but with 50-ton machines. And somehow, it worked. The Israeli High Command had gambled everything on a concept they knew better than most, that quality, positioning, and resolve could overcome numerical inferiority. They did not need to stop the entire Syrian assault, just slow it, just buy time. And, tank by tank, hill by hill, they did exactly that. The Shotkal, on paper, was not supposed to dominate a modern battlefield like this. But when paired with veterans who understood terrain and who refused to break under fire, it became more than a machine. It became a shield, a slingshot aimed at a giant. And like the story of David and Goliath, one so often invoked in Israeli military folklore, the impossible slowly became real. Some Syrian commanders realized too late that the ridges were killing fields. Their forces could not see the enemy until it was already too late. Shells rained down from invisible gun lines. And when they tried to scale the heights, the narrow roads and steep slopes turned their tanks into targets, not threats. Meanwhile, Israeli reservist men who had been pulled from their homes, many still wearing civilian clothes beneath their uniforms, began arriving in waves. They were rushed into old tanks, given rough maps, brief orders, and sent straight into the line. But they came anyway. Because the Golan was not just a border, it was the last line before home. As the sun began to set, the battlefield smoldered. Syrian armor littered the approaches to the ridge, broken and burning. But the shelling did not stop, neither did the attacks. The night would bring new dangers, especially with the Syrians equipped with Soviet night fighting gear. But for now, in the fading light, the defenders held. High above the valley, inside tanks caked in dust and fear, the Israeli crews knew they were not just fighting a battle. They were making a statement. The Shotkal was not perfect. The odds were still overwhelming. But they were still in the fight. And on the Golan Heights, sometimes, that was enough to tip history. Night fell over the Golan like a curtain of steel. The burnt orange horizon faded to black, and with it, any illusion that the worst had passed. For the Israelis holding the heights, the coming darkness did not bring rest. It brought dread, because night was when the Syrians truly came alive. Equipped with Soviet night fighting gear, the Syrian armored divisions had a lethal edge when the sun disappeared. Their T-55 and newer T-62 tanks were fitted with infrared sights and searchlights, tools that allowed them to stalk their prey through the darkness. From the ridgelines, Israeli tankers could only watch as unfamiliar beams of invisible light swept across the landscape, methodically probing for heat signatures, movement, silhouettes. For them, it was like being hunted by ghosts. The Israeli tanks, by contrast, were blind. The Shotkal had no night sights, no infrared systems. At best, the crews had access to a limited number of night vision binoculars, bulky, awkward, and barely adequate for identifying movement in the dead of night. And yet, as they had all day, the defenders adapted. They had to Tank crews developed a language of survival built on instinct and raw nerve. They memorized terrain by daylight, knowing they would have to fight in pitch black. They marked rocks, folds in the land, broken hulls, anything that could help them navigate or hide. They listened for the sounds of treads on basalt and diesel engines, humming through the cold night air. Many knew that the first warning of an attack might not come through their optics, but through vibration, through the subtle thrum in the ground beneath their boots. One Israeli commander, now dug in near the southern flank, described the experience as fighting shadows with echoes. His tank sat motionless in a shallow depression, his engine off. The crew waited in silence, their ears sharper than their eyes. Through his night vision binoculars, the commander spotted it, a faint glow, not of light, but of movement, an infrared beam dancing toward them. It was not one of theirs. A Syrian tank had locked onto their position, but in the moment of danger, clarity arrived. The commander whispered the bearing to his gunner, nudged the elevation, and gave the order, fire. The recoil jolted the crew. The flash lit the valley for a split second, and they saw the impact. The Syrian tank erupted in a fireball, the infrared light vanishing into smoke. That success was not luck. It was the result of speed, muscle memory, and an unspoken bond between crewmates who knew they could not afford to miss. Elsewhere, other Israeli tankers were not so lucky. In the blackness, Syrian units slipped behind ridges, cutting off roads and outposts. Entire Israeli positions found themselves isolated. Communications went dead. And still, somehow, the line held. Each Israeli crew knew the role they played was not just about holding their ground, it was about holding time. Every hour bought in the darkness allowed more reservists to arrive, more tanks to reach the front, more wounded to be evacuated. Even the simplest acts became heroic in the night. A young Israeli loader, barely 20, risked his life stepping out of his turret to clear a jammed breach. Another crew abandoned their immobilized tank only to spot a Syrian tank 30 meters away, its IR searchlight glowing like an eye. One man raised his binoculars, identified the silhouette, and ordered a nearby tank to open fire just seconds before the Syrian could strike first. It was chaos, but it was controlled chaos, organized through instinct, sharpened by desperation, and on top of it all, fear, not the kind that paralyzes, but the kind that burns into focus, the kind that strips away everything, except the will to survive and protect what lies behind you. For the Israelis, that meant more than the Golan. It meant their homes, their families, their entire country. In the darkness, the battle took on a different rhythm. It was not about sweeping movements or massive assaults. It was about duels, individual encounters, one tank facing another in silence, sometimes only meters apart. The infrared searchlights turned the rocky ridges into a theater of invisible fire, and each flash of cannon fire was both a risk and a statement. We are still here. By dawn, the battlefield was littered with the remains of that long night, both Syrian and Israeli. Smoke hung low over the valleys. Craters still glowed. The smell of oil and scorched metal clung to the wind. The Syrians had inflicted damage, but they had not broken through. They had not taken the heights. And despite their superior technology, despite the overwhelming odds, the defenders still held the line. In the end, it was not night vision that decided the night. It was grit, memory, and the refusal to yield. 6 years before the shells began to fall on the Golan, Israel had triumphed in a stunning, lightning-fast victory. The Six-Day War of 1967 had redrawn the map of the Middle East and left the Israeli military with a reputation of invincibility. The Golan Heights, once Syrian soil, had been taken in less than 48 hours. Now, in 1973, that memory still lingered, etched into the pride of a nation and the assumptions of its generals. But confidence is a double-edged sword. For months before October, Syrian troops had moved along the border, conducting what Israeli intelligence saw as nothing more than theater drills, rotations, exercises. It had all been done before. The build-up was visible, undeniable, but dismissed. The Arabs can't fight, one intelligence analyst had reportedly said. Another officer, when questioned, responded bluntly, they would not dare. The ghosts of 1967 whispered reassurances to the present. And so, when Syria began removing camouflage nets from artillery positions and massing armor near the front, the warnings were there, but the will to believe them was not. And then came Yom Kippur. On the most solemn day in the Jewish calendar, a day of reflection, fasting, and prayer, the quiet was shattered. Air raid sirens replaced synagogue chants. Explosions drowned out whispered confessions. Soldiers rushed from homes, some still in religious garb, others still weak from fasting. Tanks started without full crews. Guns were loaded with trembling hands. The attack was not just military, it was psychological. To be hit on Yom Kippur was not just unexpected. It was unthinkable. This was a day when even the most secular soldiers felt the weight of centuries of tradition. For many, it was a day to confront their sins, not their mortality. And suddenly, they were forced to do both at once. The Syrians did not just choose a strategic window, they struck at the soul. For frontline commanders, the disbelief was visceral. Lieutenant Colonel Yair Nafshi, leading a patrol that morning, received the first hint of danger in the form of a quiet radio call. Syrian artillery crews had begun uncovering their weapons. He turned his jeep around and gathered his men. No speeches, no orders from above, just instinct. They broke there fast, climbed into tanks, and within minutes were under fire. Elsewhere, the delay in recognition cost lives. Some outposts had no time to react. Ammunition was locked away. Radios were off. In the north, tank crews scrambled to form defensive lines with incomplete information and partial crews. In one unit, only half the tanks started. In another, commanders gave orders to engage before maps could be unfolded. The early hours of the war were chaos, and beneath the surface of every decision, every maneuver, was a deeper, quieter battle against doubt. The soldiers remembered 1967. They remembered how fast it had all fallen into place. But this time, it was not. This time, the enemy did not break. The Syrian assault kept coming day and night, hill after hill, wave after wave. And for every Israeli soldier staring down the barrel of a T-55, one truth became increasingly clear. The war of 1973 would not be won on reputation. Complacency had cost Israel the initiative. But worse, it had planted seeds of overconfidence that were now being burned out by fire and steel. And yet, amid the shock, something began to shift. Israeli crews, rattled and reeling, began to adapt. Young commanders stepped up when orders from above were too slow. Reservists, unshaven and unready, climbed into cold tanks and took positions alongside regular forces. There was no time to mourn the dead, no time to dwell on the surprise. The only way forward was through. The attack on Yom Kippur cut deep, not just because it was strategically brilliant, but because it exposed something raw and unresolved. For a nation that had risen from ashes, the fear of being overwhelmed again was not just military, it was existential. But that fear did not collapse into surrender. It hardened into resolve. In the following days, as more reservists flooded the Golan, as more tanks rumbled up the escarpments, and as more Syrian advances were blunted, the mood changed. The complacency of 1967 had shattered, but in its place rose something older, something elemental, the knowledge that survival could not be taken for granted. And so, on sacred ground, during sacred hours, Israel fought not only to defend a border, but to reclaim its sense of urgency, its humility, and its will to endure. October 7th, barely a day into the war, and the unthinkable happens. The southern line of the Israeli defense on the Golan begins to collapse. The day before, the Syrians had tried to break through en masse. They threw tanks, artillery, infantry, and airstrikes against the Israeli ridges, and were met with a storm of well-placed, high-ground fire. But today, things are different. Persistence and raw numbers begin to tell. On this second day, the Syrian command becomes bolder and more brutal. Their tanks push forward relentlessly, filling the valleys with metal and noise. Artillery pounds Israeli positions without pause. Smoke and fire blacken the ridges. Then, in a moment that breaks from traditional doctrine and spills into desperation, Syrian infantry begin filling Israeli anti-tank ditches by hand. These trenches had been carved along the front line by Israeli engineers after 1967. Deep, wide, and positioned for maximum disruption, they were designed to break up tank formations and funnel attackers into kill zones. But the Syrians adapt. Lacking bridging units at the right place and time, commanders send waves of infantry, some wielding only shovels, others crawling under fire to collapse the trenches with their bare hands and bodies. And somehow it works. Behind this grisly effort, a Syrian armored brigade pushes forward, finally managing to breach Israeli positions and reach Bekaa Road, a critical artery that leads west, deeper into Israeli-held territory. The implications are enormous. If the Syrians seize this road and continue their momentum, they can slice the Golan in two and open a path to the Jordan River. From there, it is only hours to the Sea of Galilee. And then, the Israeli heartland. Panic ripples through Israeli command. On the southern flank, units are fragmented and exhausted. Many tanks have been destroyed or disabled. Ammunition runs low. Some positions are abandoned simply because there is no one left to defend them. Radio chatter grows frantic. Field commanders request reinforcements that have not arrived. Morale teeters on the edge. But then, from the west, come the reservists. Israel's strategy of relying on a small standing army supplemented by rapid mobilization is risky, especially when the enemy strikes first. Mobilizing thousands of troops and machines from civilian life takes time. And in war, time is blood. But this time, just enough time is saved. Through the night of October 6th and into the early morning of the 7th, convoys of reservists thunder northward. Many of these men had been at synagogue the day before. Others were at home with families. Most received emergency calls while still fasting. They dropped everything, meals, prayers, holidays, and raced toward the front. They arrive in old buses, private cars, anything with wheels. At staging points, they are issued gear, tanks, weapons, sometimes with no formal briefings, no unit cohesion, no guarantees. One reservist later recalled, "I did not even know who was in the tank next to me. But we loaded the shells and drove forward, and forward they go." The first wave of tanks from the 679th Reserve Armored Brigade reaches the southern Golan, just as Syrian forces are attempting to consolidate their gains at Bekaa. These are not fresh soldiers, they are fathers, shopkeepers, teachers, some older than the tanks they are driving. But they bring with them something the enemy does not expect: fury and fear, channeled into defense. They slam into the Syrian flanks like a hammer. Coordination is chaotic but effective. Reserve crews use terrain expertly, striking from folds in the land and hidden tracks. Artillery units, now reinforced, begin laying accurate fire downrange. The narrowness of the Syrian advance becomes its weakness funneled into the road. Tanks become targets, a traffic jam of death. One Israeli tank crew, outnumbered 5-1, holds a choke point near Bekaa for nearly an hour, disabling multiple Syrian vehicles before retreating under smoke cover. Another group uses a burned-out Syrian tank as cover, using its husk as a firing position. By afternoon, the Syrian advance stalls. By evening, it halts. The road they had fought so hard to reach, filled with ambition, blood, and hope, is now a graveyard of machines. Fires light the sky. The wreckage of war smolders under an iron sun. And the Israeli line, battered and reeling, holds. The breach in the south will haunt Israeli commanders for years. It was a failure born of overconfidence and underestimation. But the recovery spurred by citizen soldiers who responded without hesitation becomes a symbol of national grit. For the Syrians, the near breakthrough offers a glimpse of victory. For Israel, it is a reminder that borders are only lines. What defends them is people, urgency, and resolve. And in that moment, on Bekaa Road, the tide begins to turn. The Syrian war plan was bold, surgical, and dangerously close to succeeding. Their armored columns were not just charging randomly into the Golan. Each thrust was calculated to achieve a singular objective: the capture of key bridges over the Jordan River. From there, the route would open to Tiberias, the Sea of Galilee, and deeper into Israel's civilian heartland. Victory was not merely measured in kilometers. It was measured in how close Syrian forces could get to the heart of Israeli society before the defenders could rally. And for a brief moment it seemed possible. With the southern front of the Golan breached, Syrian tanks surged through the opening like a torrent. Their advance formations included the 5th Infantry Division and elements of the 1st Armored Division. The plan: split the Israeli defenses in two, use momentum to isolate units, and then sweep toward the Jordan crossings while cutting off reinforcement routes from the west. It was a classic maneuver. Warfare strategy, speed, shock, and mass. But plans die in contact with the enemy, and on the winding roads of the Golan, one enemy proved more dangerous than the Syrians expected: time. Because time, in those critical hours, was bought not by brigades or divisions, but by fragments. Scattered Israeli units, some no larger than a platoon, took position along roads and ridge lines. Their mission was not to stop the Syrian army. That would have been impossible. Their task was simpler and more desperate: delay them. Just minutes, sometimes only seconds, meant everything. One such stand took place near Nafach Junction, a critical crossroads that linked the Syrian axis of advance to the roads leading west. Israeli tanks, outnumbered and hastily crewed by reservists, who had only just arrived, dug in at reverse slopes and fire positions that had been scouted years earlier during routine training drills. Those drills, dismissed by many at the time as redundant, suddenly became lifelines. Captain Meir Zamir, commanding one of the forward units, recounted seeing a column of Syrian T-55s cresting a distant ridge, silhouetted in the morning haze. His orders were clear: hold them. Nothing more. He split his remaining tanks across a narrow ravine, giving the appearance of greater numbers. His gunners were told to fire only when certain of a hit. Every shell counted. And it worked! The lead Syrian tanks took fire, burned and halted. Confusion spread down the line. Radio chatter spiked. With only a handful of well-placed shots, the Israeli defenders forced the Syrians to redeploy, wasting precious time. In another instance, an Israeli jeep-mounted anti-tank team ambushed a reconnaissance element ahead of a main column. It was a small engagement, 3 missiles, 2 hits, but it triggered a 30-minute delay as the Syrian command paused to reassess what they feared was a larger force ahead. It was not. But perception became reality. At yet another choke point near the village of Hushniya, a pair of Centurion tanks took position behind a collapsed wall and fired down a narrow track, bottling the advance of an entire armored company. When they finally withdrew, the Syrians surged forward only to run headlong into Israeli mines. These actions were not textbook strategy. They were improvisations born of necessity, moments of individual courage and quick thinking. But cumulatively, they achieved what no map or plan could predict. They bought hours. And those hours changed everything. Because during those delays, Israeli reinforcements kept coming. More reservists arrived by the truckload. Artillery was repositioned. Command structures, initially fragmented, began to reassert control. Air support, previously grounded by Syrian anti-aircraft defenses, found gaps to strike through. Bit by bit, the Israeli line, broken and reeling, began to harden. The Syrians, meanwhile, lost what they needed most: tempo. Their offensive, which had relied on speed and simultaneity, became staggered. Units that were supposed to meet at bridgeheads over the Jordan found themselves arriving out of sync. Coordination faltered. And as their column stretched thin, they became vulnerable not just to Israeli tanks, but to exhaustion, supply issues, and confusion. By the evening of October 8th, the forward momentum had stalled. The bridges remained in Israeli hands. The window to change the war's geography had closed. Looking back, the defense of those choke points reads like a myth. Small groups of tank crews and infantrymen, many facing their first battle, standing in the path of an armored juggernaut. But it was not myth. It was real. It was grit. And it was the thread that kept the Golan from unraveling completely. In modern war, victory often comes not from the size of an army, but from the moments when a few refuse to yield. On those ridges, on those roads, the Syrians learned that Israeli resolve could not be measured on paper. It had to be faced in fire. By October 9, 1973, the war on the Golan had boiled down to one narrow valley, a strip of land so bloodied and scorched that it would earn its name in whispers and textbooks, the Valley of Tears. Here, at the northern front, Syria had gathered its final hammer blow. 250 tanks, many of them newer, faster T-62s, had massed for a last-ditch offensive. Their goal was simple and devastating: break the Israeli lines once and for all, seize the ridges overlooking the Galilee, and open a corridor straight into the Israeli interior. For Damascus, this was not just military necessity. It was about national redemption. The humiliation of 1967 had to be reversed. And in their calculations, the Israelis, cut off, exhausted and outnumbered, would finally break. But calculations can't measure will. Waiting in the valley were the remnants of the Israeli 7th Armored Brigade. They had started the war with around 100 tanks. Now, barely 30 remained. They were battered, low on fuel and shells, and many of their gunners had not slept in days. but they had something left: discipline, memory, and resolve hardened by every hour of fire. Colonel Avigdor Ben-Gal, commander of the 7th, refused to yield. He understood the stakes. If the Syrians broke through here, there was no second line, no reserve, no fallback. The northern flank would collapse, and with it perhaps the war. So he made a choice: to dig in, to fight, and to turn the valley into a killing ground. The geography of the Valley of Tears was both a curse and a gift. It was narrow, bordered by high ground on both sides. Syrian tanks had to descend from the east and approach in tight formations. The Israelis, perched on reverse slopes, waited like archers behind a wall. It was a hunter's trap, one that would only work if the defenders held their nerve. And hold they did. When the Syrian assault began at dawn, the first wave came like thunder. Lines of T-62s crested the eastern hills, their long barrels flashing with fire. Behind them, support tanks and infantry vehicles rolled in waves. Artillery pounded the Israeli positions, churning dirt and throwing metal into the air. The noise was unrelenting, an orchestra of steel, smoke, and screams. But the Israelis did not fire immediately. They waited. Ben-Gal's orders were clear: let them come closer. Let them commit. Only when the lead tanks came into perfect range did the shot-cal tanks open fire. Each shot was deliberate. Range, 3,000 meters. Target, lead tank. Result, a plume of flame, and another, and another. Within minutes, the Syrian front line began to buckle under the sheer precision of Israeli fire. But still they came. Wave after wave, Syrian commanders pushed forward. Their tanks maneuvered with aggression, attempting to flank and swarm. And the Israelis responded in kind, shifting positions, taking up new fire angles, using the terrain like a dance floor of survival. One Israeli commander later described it: "We fought like ghosts, hit, move, vanish, hit again." The air grew thick with the stench of burning diesel and the cries of wounded men. Shell casings piled in turrets. Radio channels were jammed with reports of breaches, hits, and desperate requests for ammunition. One Israeli tank commander lost both his loader and gunner to a direct hit. He stayed in the fight, working the cannon alone. By noon, the field below the Israeli positions was littered with twisted wrecks. Smoke hung in the valley like a curtain, yet the Syrians refused to stop. For them, retreat meant shame, and so their tanks kept coming, even when logic said not to. At one point, the Syrians managed to press within 800 meters of Israeli lines. Too close. Far too close. But instead of folding, Ben-Gal radioed for all remaining tanks to prepare for a counterstrike. It was madness. 30 tanks against more than 200. But it was the only option. With engines roaring and dust rising, the 7th Brigade surged forward. From the ridgeline, they plunged into the valley itself, catching the advancing Syrians off guard. Israeli gunners fired on the move, aiming by instinct and memory. They slammed into the Syrian flank and tore through it like a blade. By sunset, the Valley of Tears was silent. Smoke curled from over 260 destroyed Syrian tanks. The field had been transformed into a graveyard of steel and ambition. The Israeli line held barely. The 7th Brigade had lost half its men and nearly all of its machines, but it had done the impossible. In the days that followed, the Israeli counteroffensive would begin. The Syrians would fall back. The tide of war would shift, but the story of that narrow valley would remain, not just as a battlefield, but as a symbol of defiance, of desperation, of how a handful of men, when pushed beyond their limit, can still stand. The Valley of Tears became sacred, not because of its name, but because of the price paid to defend it. October 11th, 1973. After 5 brutal days of near collapse, exhaustion, and bloodshed, the tide finally turned. Israel, having survived the onslaught, now went on the offensive. What began as a desperate defense transformed into a ferocious counterattack, a moment when a nation clawed its way from the edge of disaster and pushed forward with everything it had left. The Israeli Defense Forces had no illusions. This was not a war for land. This was a war for existence. Every inch retaken in the Golan was not just terrain, it was survival, identity, and vengeance for the fallen. The scars of the initial invasion were fresh, shattered tanks, blackened hills, makeshift graves. But with reinforcements now fully mobilized, the IDF surged into action. Hundreds of Israeli tanks, reinforced by thousands of newly arrived troops, advanced along the same battered paths that Syrian armor had stormed down days earlier. Now the Israelis followed those paths in reverse, but with intent to break, not hold. Intelligence officers pored over maps. Commanders studied terrain. Every ridge, every village, every ambush site was burned into memory. They knew the ground intimately because they had bled on it. The counteroffensive began near Nafach, the critical crossroads where the southern and central Golan met. What had once been a contested choke point was now the launch pad for an iron wave. Showdown tanks refueled, rearmed, and filled with crews desperate to strike back rolled through plumes of dust. Behind them came half-tracks and jeeps packed with infantry, medics, mechanics. Even reservists who had never fired in combat found themselves driving into Syria's fading lines. Village by village, the Israelis pushed forward. At Hushniya, the site of Syria's planned breakthrough and supply depot, IDF units met stiff resistance. Syrian forces had dug in, anchoring their last hopes on holding this ground. But the Israelis came with precision. Air support swooped overhead, bombing artillery positions and cutting escape routes. Tanks flanked from both sides, trapping defenders in a tightening noose. The battle was short, brutal, and decisive. Within hours, Syrian units began to break. Some abandoned vehicles and ran. Others fired wildly, confused and cornered. By midday, Israeli troops entered the village center. What they found was chaos-burning trucks, discarded uniforms, and wounded men stumbling through rubble. But what they also found was momentum. That momentum carried northward. From the valley floors up to the high ridges, Israeli armor clawed back position after position. They were not just reclaiming lost ground, they were taking the war to the enemy. Syrian forces, stretched and disorganized, could not maintain coherent lines. Their supply routes had been severed by earlier Israeli raids. Commanders lost contact with units. Morale, once bolstered by early victories, now crumbled under constant pressure. At one point, Israeli paratroopers seized telephone shams, a high point, with sweeping views of Syrian positions. From there, artillery spotters directed devastating salvos into retreating columns. The battlefield became a panorama of destruction, black trails of smoke rising over dozens of Syrian tanks, roads jammed with twisted steel, scattered helmets glinting in the sun. For the Syrians, it was a nightmare. The very landscape that had once given them strategic leverage now trapped them. The volcanic ridges and narrow canyons of the Golan turned into channels of fire. Every retreat, a gauntlet. Every ridge, a potential ambush. In one telling encounter, an Israeli tank company intercepted a Syrian column, attempting to flee eastward. The Syrians, unaware of Israeli positioning, drove into a ravine flanked by high rocks. Within minutes they were surrounded. The Israeli tanks, waiting in shadow, opened fire from above. What followed was not a battle, it was an execution. Still, not all Syrians ran. Scattered units fought to the last, covering the retreat of comrades holding crossroads with bitter determination. These final stands, often led by junior officers, earned quiet respect from their Israeli counterparts. The war was fierce, but never without humanity. By nightfall on October 11th, the Golan Heights belonged to Israel again. But this was not a return to normal. The cost was staggering: thousands dead, families shattered, landscapes forever altered. The hills echoed not with victory songs, but with the low hum of engines and the quiet prayers of survivors. Soldiers wandered among the wreckage looking for lost friends, lost names. And above it all, a terrible question lingered. How close had they come to the brink? The counterattack was more than military. It was psychological. It erased the shame of surprise, the helplessness of the first hours. It gave the defenders back their confidence, and the country back its breath. Yet the war was not over. Farther north, in a place soon to be known as the Valley of Tears, another storm brewed. The Syrians had not given up. Their last, most brutal offensive still waited. But for now, the heights were secure. The counterattack had worked. And in that moment, history shifted not with speeches or treaties, but with the grinding tracks of tanks reclaiming the hills, where the fate of a nation had nearly been lost. The battle for the Golan Heights was never just about hills and tanks. It was about the razor edge between survival and annihilation. In October 1973, a tiny nation stood against overwhelming force and refused to break. The terrain was brutal, the odds impossible, and yet, through a mixture of preparation, improvisation, and sheer will, Israel held the line, not without loss, not without fear, but with unwavering determination. For Assyria, the Golan became a symbol of national trauma and unfinished business. For Israel, it became sacred ground proof that vigilance could never sleep, not even on the holiest day. The war changed how both nations saw themselves, how they planned, how they fought, and how they remembered. Decades later, the Valley of Tears is quiet. Wind rustles through tank wrecks. Grass grows where soldiers once bled. But history has not left. It waits in the silence, in the stone, in the scars. What happened on the Golan Heights is more than military history. It is a lesson in resilience, in the cost of miscalculation, and in the courage of those who stand when retreat is not an option. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, share it. And remember, sometimes the fate of nations turns not on strength alone, but on the courage to hold the ground no matter what comes over the ridge.